hopefully we'll be doing some more programs similar to this. We have another exhibit coming in March about, it's Smoke Over Oklahoma. It's all about the railroads, and so we'll probably have something similar to this at that time. We want to thank, especially tonight, Mike Grantham for bringing this exhibit to us from the Oklahoma Historical Society, and also want to thank Jerry Alexander for some information that he furnished for me. So some of you had a chance to look at the exhibit from the Oklahoma Historical Society. I might want to point out just one person on here, and he's in the bottom right corner here. Ralph Rowe. He was born in 1906 and shows up in Stevens County in Duncan on the census of 1910. So he was brought to Duncan when he was 4 years old. His mother died when he was very young, and he and his brothers pretty much grew up on the streets of Duncan, were not very well educated, and by the time he was 14, he was in a reform school, and in 1920, and from 27 to, and I forgot my glasses, he was admitted to Huntsville, Texas, in a prison there when he was about 27 years old. And then in 35, he went to Leavenworth, and he kind of had, he's kind of a rough character and was pretty good at escaping. So they sent him to Alcatraz. And in 1935, I might not need them, but it sure helped. He was in Alcatraz, and he and his partner in crime, who was also from Oklahoma, in the picture just to the left there, Ted Cole. So it's Ralph Rowe, Ted Cole, kind of wrong, were at Alcatraz, and they escaped. The only two men that's ever tried to escape Alcatraz. They were both from Oklahoma. Yeah, so you can read all about those things. It's an interesting exhibit, and hope you enjoy it. He was serving for robbery of the First National Bank in Sulphur. That's why he was serving time. Got 99 years for that. And in 1958, it was still an open case with the FBI because they suspected that he drowned in the San Francisco Bay, but he could have survived. He survived. There's some other extenuating circumstances that looks like he did, and I have information. You can read all about that if you're interested. Don't want to get too bogged down with that. I would like to thank all of you that are members of our association. That helps us to put on programs like this, and if you'd like to support the museum, because that's how we're supported, by memberships and donations, I just catch me and I can give you some paperwork on that, and we sure appreciate all the support that we do get. At this time, I'll turn this time over to Kyle Collins, the president of our board of directors, and I just want to mention first, we have a great board of directors, and some of them are in this room, and they support me and help me in so many ways, and I appreciate their support. Jan Cole, Carlos, Vicki, Blake Pickard, Mike Grantham, and of course our president is going to speak this time, Kyle Collins. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Copa. All right, got a good crowd here. This is a little bit more than we expected, obviously, and we're pulling extra chairs in. So I see a number of Marlow people here. I wonder why. Okay, if you're here and you live in Marlow, put your hand up. Okay, good crowd. Good crowd. Thanks for coming. Okay, we have this. Go off script here a little bit. It has been a while since the Marlow Brothers story has been told. In fact, I have seen some newspaper clippings, and we're talking like 1997. So it's been probably about 25 years. The story needs to be told. It's a good story. It's an important story. It is a story that gives courage to our football team, because the football team never gives up, nor did the Marlow Brothers. So It's a good story, and we have a good storyteller coming up here in just a minute, and I'm going to introduce our speaker. It is Travis Madison Childs. Teaches U.S. history at Cameron University in Lawton, Oklahoma, specializing in 18th and 19th century United States. He is also the Social Studies Education Coordinator at Cameron University. He lives in Henrietta, Texas, and is a member and former president of the Clay County, Texas Historical Society. He currently serves as the Clay County, Texas Historical Commission, being chair, and works with the Clay County 1890 Jail Museum and Heritage Center. His role as a history teacher, social studies education coordinator, and historical commission chair. He regularly gives presentations for public and area schools about history, exploring how historical events and individuals shape how we remember the past. At this time, I'd like to introduce or have Travis to come up. Travis Madison Childs.
Well, on behalf of the Social Sciences Department at Cameron, thank you for inviting me to come and speak. Let me first start by saying I'm in no way an expert on the Marlow Brothers. And so if y'all come after me, I'm closer to the door. And I'll run as fast as I can. As my short bio says, what I really like about history is the combination of what happened and the way we remember what happened. And quite often we learn a lot more about ourselves and how we choose to remember the past. And the Marlow Brothers is one of these stories. It says a lot about us and what we want to do with their story. How many of you have seen the movie Sons of Katie Elder? Okay. Can you remember the Sons of Katie Elder? If I point things out, you go, oh, I remember that scene. There's a reason they picked the Marlow Brothers to base a movie on. And when I was a kid and I thought about John Wayne movies, I thought John Wayne was always the hero, that it was white hats and black hats. But as an adult, and I watch John Wayne movies all the time, he's never really the best guy. He might be the hero of the story, but he's a questionable character over and over and over again. Count how many times he is divorced or separated from his wife. Yeah. He is always, even when he's a lawman, he's often also in trouble with the law. In his greatest roles, in his most famous roles, he's a questionable character. And I didn't get that as a kid, and what I now realize is because that's the story of the West. We like heroes and villains. One of the things that happens for me teaching freshmen is they want me just to tell them who's the good guy and who's the bad guy and give me the facts and that's it. And I say, I can't do that because that's not who we are as people. Even the best of us do some things that are bad. And so some people will remember us for those negative things. And even the worst of us do some things good. And people remember that about us. And that's what I deal with. And it really frustrates young people. Because they're like, just tell me. History is not white hats and black hats. It's the shades of gray. It's the things in the middle. And the Marlow Brothers are one of those groups. I'm going to ask you, if you've got your phone, get it out and go to Maps. Because that's going to be your visual help as we navigate our way through the story of the Marlow Brothers. So we're going to go into Texas from here. We're going to go and see the places. And thankfully, the maps, I'm going to get my phone out as well so I can guide you in that so we can look at what the maps say. When doing research on the Marlow Brothers, what becomes clear is that even the people who've written about it aren't really sure what they're talking about. Because they're having to base it on some sources. Where are those sources? How do you get that information? Who's telling it? I know in my own personal life, for my family, we're from Clay County, Texas. We've been in there since 1882, and it's probably actually part of the story probably went right past my great-grandparents' house, because it's on the road between Henrietta and Graham. That we're not really good at remembering the negatives of our family, but boy, we've got some things to say about other people. And those people also like to remind me of how many alcoholics were in my family. And I like to tell them about the people in their family who ended up in mental institutions. We do that. We pick and we choose. And we have a tendency to kind of forget about some of our negatives and not talk about it because it brings us dishonor, whatever we've decided about that. And yet we remember those things. We like to gossip about them. And that's part of the problem here too, because it really does shade what's going on. So when we look at this information, if you have differing opinions on this stuff, I'm going to ask you, what are your sources? because history is all about the sources. How do we get our information? So I'm going to be reading to you from what the newspapers said at the time, because that's the best that we can do for how it was reported. And anything else that you think about it, that may be how it gets passed down from person to person, and that's the way it goes. What I would encourage all of us to do is leave people in the past in the past. They did what they did. We can't make them into better people, and we can't make them into worse people. They're gone. They lived their lives. And it's no dishonor to point out some of the things they did that are a problem, and it's not dishonest to point out some of the good things that they did that would have affected people. But it's controversial. You're aware that we're having these history wars now that are being fought all over the place. And boy, we really just want people to read for yourself and think for yourself and decide what matters most. So if you've seen Sons of Katie Elder, the end of the movie is they go and they get these horses, and then they're accused of having stolen these horses, and that leads to this whole thing that goes down, plus whatever happened to Billy the sheriff. That's actually the beginning of the story. The beginning of the Marlow Brothers is something happened with horses, or so somebody said. In doing some research, it's not even clear, according to the historians, where this happened. Some say it happened in Colorado, and others say it happened here in Oklahoma, which may tell us then that maybe several things happened, and some messages got passed, and people made some decisions. So let's work our way through this story. It's worth pointing out that 1890 is the end of the West. It's the year in which the U.S. Census comes out and says that there are now 2 people per square mile, therefore the frontier is now officially closed. Now, people quickly abandoned some of those places and technically reopened, but there is an end coming in 1890, and this story is in 1890, and in some ways, this story of vigilante justice followed by court decisions going all the way to the Supreme Court also symbolizes the end of the Wild West, that something has changed in what Americans want their places to be. So I'm sure you all know that this is Dr. Marlow. He is the father of the Marlows, for whom Marlow is named. And he died in 1885, and that's really when the story starts to change. And I'm not suggesting it's his death that causes this. I don't have that information, but it is interesting that that's when the first thing happens. In real life, Boone, this man here, he's Dean Martin. That's Dean Martin's character. He plays Boone. And by the way, if John Wayne played sketchy characters, Dean Martin only played sketchy characters in Westerns. He's always up to something. Sometimes in a family, there is a bad seed, someone who seems to have that problem. I don't know about y'all's family, but in our family, we moved to Texas because one of the cousins, one of the brothers, he shot somebody. I don't know if he did or not, but it seems like every family has that story. Well, Boone is that guy. He's the guy that things are connected to. So if you remember in the movie, Dean Martin is accused of having murdered a guy in Texas in a poker game that went south. Well, that really happened in the case of Boone. He was in Vernon, in Will Barker County. So if you've got your map out, you know where Vernon is. It's west of Wichita Falls. Okay, so they're from this basic area. They had moved here from other places. They were going to move to Colorado. They're going to come back, and that's also part of the story. These are people in transition. That's what the frontier is. People come and they go, and they're always looking for a better place, and sometimes they return to some place that they've been. But that's when the trouble began in 1885, when he was accused of murder. Was it a murder? I don't know, and you don't know. Somebody died. He shot them. Some suggest that perhaps the guy that was murdered was actually someone who was trying to cause problems. Maybe he was working for somebody who tried to drive settlers out of the area. This is a time in which, in 1884, in Clay County, Texas, that's when the fence-cutting war happens, in which the governor of Texas has sent in troops because farmers and ranchers are killing each other over barbed wire fences. I'm from Texas, I just said barbed wire. Barbed wire fences. Barbed wire. Barbed wire and old business, that's what I know. And so for them, it is a place that is still in that transition. It's not quite perfectly settled. It's not quite perfectly wild. It's in between. The Marlows were small-scale ranchers. The boys did all sorts of jobs, including working on the Fort Worth to Denver line. The Fort Worth to Denver is essentially where 287 goes through Texas. That's the railroad that they built in the early 1880s that connected Fort Worth all the way to Denver. But in this part of the story, 287 runs right next to the Fort Worth to Denver. They lived relatively quietly, it would seem, until the death of Dr. Wilson and the killing of a cowboy by Boone. He claimed self-defense, and he was advised to make a run for it. Because can you really get justice? Will there be a rush to justice? That's not clear for him, and so he fled all the way to Colorado. And part of the story of the Marlows is that where one of them goes, the rest go. And the Marlow family moved to Colorado as well. And that's where they were living, and clearly while they were there, some of them got married. George in particular married a woman from Colorado, and his going to Colorado will also play a part in the story. In 1888, they returned back to the Indian Territory, back to the basic area that they had come from, near Anadarko. And there, George and Charlie and Alf, so Alfred, Alf is short for that, they had all married by this point, and several of them had children. They were building a life. George went back to Colorado to visit his in-laws, and maybe this is where the horse thieving story starts. Again, I read some stuff that suggested that there was a bulletin that went out that said, be on the lookout for the Marlows, they're stealing a bunch of horses. Well, it doesn't appear that they're in Colorado. It looks like only George is there. So maybe that's the beginning of some sort of rumor that comes into the story. Another character in this story is the U.S. Deputy Marshal in Graham. Graham was the federal district for the area, the Northwest Federal District. If you're familiar with like True Grit, Fort Smith, Arkansas is that place on the eastern side of Oklahoma. Graham is that place in northwest Texas in this part. And so they do have some jurisdiction in this particular area of Oklahoma. And here's the story about this Marshal Ed Johnson. From March 8, 1888, Captain Burke Burnett, or Burke Burnett, there's a debate on how we pronounce his name, who was a rancher in the area around Wichita Falls, had returned from up the Fort Worth and Denver line. And he says the Deputy United States Marshal E.W. Johnson was shot in the arm at Wichita Falls a few days ago. The wound necessitating an amputation is now with relatives at Alvord. Alvord is between Bowie and Fort Worth, going down 287. Marshal Johnson is well known in Fort Worth. Like many people, he wasn't just a deputy marshal. He was also hired by the Stock Raisers Association of Northwest Texas to look after the cattle rustling. Today we call them the Texas and Southwest Cattle Raisers Association. So he's somebody who is both privately employed by ranchers to look out for their interest, and he's the deputy marshal, and perhaps this causes some problems as well. If you've ever seen the movie Tom Horn, Tom Horn is that exact same character. Tom Horn also a real person. So Graham is where he is headquartered, and he will play an important story here because now there's this report that the Marlow brothers have been involved in some version of horse stealing. Specifically, they're accused of having stolen horses from 3 Native Americans in the Fort Sill area. And we'll talk about them a little bit later on because they don't seem to think that they've been stolen from at all. So what is this? Again, we're not really sure what this is. We know what the court's going to rule on it. But here's the story from the Dallas Morning News in September 1888. What the papers throughout Texas are talking about. The Wichita Light, that's the newspaper, of September the 5th says, Deputy United States Marshal Ed Johnson was in town Sunday on his way to Graham with a full company of outlaws, some of whom have been wanted by the United States authorities for a long time. The names of the parties are Alf, Charlie, Ep. Ep is Llewellyn, sometimes abbreviated Ellie for Llewellyn, but also typically referred to as Ep in these stories. And Boone Marlow, all brothers, and Jack Netzel, William Moncroft, and Dick Phelps. Boone Marlow is charged with the murder of a man named Holston in Wilbarger County some 3 years ago. With the exception of Phelps, the entire party was arrested in the territory. It is a pretty good haul, and at this rate, it will not require any great length of time to thin out the lawless elements so long infesting the country over the river. Oh, you Oklahomans, wild group you are. Gotta clean you out. Well, they've been arrested, and George is in Colorado. And so when he returns back to Oklahoma, he finds out that the family has all been taken down to Graham. So if you got your map, you got your phone out, they probably looks like they went to Wichita Falls first and then made their way south to Graham. We'll talk about the other Graham Road in just a little bit. So now he's got the question of what do we do? He's clearly now the head of the family because his father's gone and his brothers have all been arrested, and he and his mother make the decision to move to Graham. They're going to go there to be with their family yet again. Now, George was also arrested when he returned. When he got to Fort Sill, he was arrested on the suspicion that he was somehow involved, but there's absolutely no evidence to this because he had been in Colorado, so he was let go and decided, as I said, to move his family down to Graham. Graham is located just off the Brazos River, and It is near Fort Belknap, which is outside of Newcastle. So that's a place that had been settled in Texas. There was actually a reservation there before the Civil War. Before Fort Sill was an Indian reservation for the Comanche and the Kiowa, there was one at Fort Belknap. And so it's been a part of the frontier line that extends from Fort Sill all the way down to Laredo, going back at this point many, many decades. So, as I said, he was there. Now, when he moves the family down to go see if he can get his brothers out, he's arrested yet again on these suspicions. So now all 5 of them are in jail. They were indicted for stealing horses, as I said, from the 3 Native American men, although none of the Native Americans ever testified against them or seemed to have claimed that they'd ever been robbed from. It appears that there were 2 Caddo and 1 Comanche. And there's some interesting quotes that I read, but it wasn't really cited where they came from, so I'm going to leave them be. They rented a farm from Oscar Denson, who lived outside of Graham, and Mother Marlow bailed them out, and they lived on that farm while they waited for their court date. And that's why they're in Young County in Texas, outside of Graham, waiting for the trial about their horse thieving. Now, while this is going on, Deputy Marshall, aware that Boone had been accused of murder 3 years earlier, decides to do something about that too. And so he went to Vernon to get a warrant up for his arrest for the murder as well. And then goes back to now arrest Boone on that particular crime. Again, is it murder? Who knows? So have horses been stolen? I don't know. We don't know. Was it a murder? We don't know. What we know is these guys have been arrested. Now, if it isn't murder and it isn't really horse thieving, then clearly they're being persecuted by the police. That's how they have to feel, that the government is out to get them. If it is murder and if it is horse thieving, they have to be wondering, are they going to be found guilty in this trial that's coming up? What is the evidence against them? So here's a story from January 1889 from the Dallas Morning News, and it says, "Lynchers wreck a jail in an effort to hang the Marlow brothers." So here they're living outside, they're doing this work. Now there's a lynch mob coming to get them. What happened in between? What happened in between is the sheriff in the area, just like in the movie The Sons of Katie Elder, came to arrest Boone specifically and was killed. Now, in some of the accounts, it would indicate that the good guy in the story is the sheriff. His name is Marion Wallace. And if you watch The Sons of Katie Elder, Paul Fix is the good guy. Billy is the good guy. He does nothing wrong. He works for them. And the fact that he's the one who's killed is the great tragedy in the story. And it would appear that that's the case here as well. He's with his deputy, Tom Collier, who appears to be something of a hothead. And again, it's unclear what happened because the witnesses in this are Tom Collier and the Marlows. So how are they going to tell their story of what went down? Here's what the newspaper said before we got to it. The Fort Worth Gazette of December 1788 says, "M.D. Wallace of Young County dangerously wounded by one of the Marlow brothers. M.D. Wallace, sheriff of Young County, was dangerously shot by one of the Marlow brothers today at Benson's farm." It may be Denson's farm, but 15 miles south of Graham. The 5 Marlow brothers were arrested several months ago for theft of horses in the Indian Territory. They were all out on bail. The one that shot Wallace was charged with murder in Wilbarger County, and for this offense, Wallace had a warrant for his arrest. Tom Collier, a deputy sheriff, was also very slightly shot in the melee, the ball grazing his head above the right eye. Collier goes to the back, he pulls his gun, he seems to have said some rather brave words, and the gun battle ensued. And it would appear that Sheriff Wallace was not involved in this, that he was out front, that he hasn't a part of this, that apparently he may have even been their friend. He may have been someone who defended them. Apparently Sheriff Wallace and Deputy Johnson hate each other. And so there's all this Young County politics going on, and maybe the Marlows are involved in that. And so Collier may well have been the instigator in this, but later on the Marlows say that they didn't even know the sheriff was there. They saw a movement, they shot into the darkness essentially, and that's where they hit the sheriff, who later died from his wounds. And there's some reason to believe this might be true, because Ep Marlow got on his horse and rode to Graham to get a doctor for the sheriff. I don't know that that's what you would do if you're the ones who just murdered somebody. And so he's going to go get that help. So maybe he believes that he's going to be able to say that this was an accident, we weren't sure what was going on. Boone is yet again the one who's involved in this, and Boone is something of a different character. Unfortunately for the Marlows, Collier had beaten them back to town. So by the time the Marlows show up looking for a doctor, the town knows that their sheriff has been gunned down by the Marlows. And this is when the lynch mob mentality starts to build against them. Deputy Collier, having gone back to Graham, returned with a posse to arrest all of the Marlow brothers, essentially. Boone had already made a run for it yet again, and so it's Charlie that's left behind. George and Alf had not been at the cabin, so again, they have nothing to do with this. That won't stop them from being arrested. And they were also thrown in jail for complicity. Well, you didn't do it, but your brothers did, and you might have if you'd been here, so that's good enough. Off to jail they went. Boone, yet again, is on the run, is alone, having been charged with murder yet again. That's 2 charges against him. That's 2 trials he'll be waiting on. The brothers this time will not get out on bail. The bail was set far too high. This time they're stuck in the jail. Boone remained a fugitive with a price on his head, and his brothers are waiting for the trial. So again, in January 1889, from the Fort Worth Gazette, it says, the 4 Marlow brothers and Cummings escaped from jail last night, about 8 o'clock, by sawing through the bars of their cage. They let themselves down to the ground by making ropes of their blankets. The Marlows were in jail for theft of horses in the Indian Territory and also for the murder of Sheriff Wallace. Cummings was charged with taking stolen property into the Indian Territory. Fearing that they were not going to get a safe trial, they did clearly try to make a run for it. They stole a knife and started cutting through the bars. As they were going back to their the cabin that they were renting, that's when they were arrested yet again. So here's what the story ends up saying. They're now put in jail. They're going to be chained together by the foot after this because of their making a run for it. So lynchers wreck a jail in an effort to hang the Marlow brothers. The guards overpowered, but the prisoners, in the reverse order of things, walk out the mob, the probable cause of the attack. Now, it appears that the mob is trying to say, we're here to free you. And some stories say that the Marlows say, we're not interested, thank you very much. We'll stay right here. We don't want to go free anymore, mob. They're not there to free them. They're there to kill them. United States Marshal Cable yesterday received the following startling telegram from Deputy United States Marshal Johnson at Graham. The jail was attacked last night by a mob of 30 men for the Marlow brothers. Shall I move them? The cages are cut to pieces. General Cabell, he was a Confederate general during the Civil War, is now the U.S. Marshal, and he was the former mayor of Dallas. He was the mayor of Dallas in 1874 to 76, from 77 to 79, and from 1883 to 1885. On receipt of the above, wired his deputy asking for who the mob were, ordering the removal of the federal prisoners under a strong guard, and instructing the guard to be very careful. Later in the day, a second telegram came saying, we do not know, but that the mob were enemies of the Marlow brothers. Let me make this clear. We think they may have been here to kill them, not liberate them. Intelligence of an unofficial character received last night was to the effect that 5 men had been on guard, one of whom watched while the others slept, that the sleepers were overpowered by the mob when they tore down the jail, and the mob were then repulsed by the prisoners. The fact is, the thought goes to show the design of the mob was to lynch the Marlows, against whom public indignation has been aroused by the killing of Marion Wallace, Sheriff of Young County, by Boone Marlow on the 17th of December. So again, they say, we're not going, we're going to stay here. It seems that they're wanting justice to take its course instead. So having received the news that that there's a mob out to kill them, that's not justice, whatever's happening, that's not justice. This marshal in Dallas sends word to move them to Weatherford, Texas. And if you look on your map and you scroll from Graham, about 60 miles to the east towards Fort Worth is Weatherford. Weatherford is 40 miles west of Fort Worth. And that's where the road goes from Graham to Weatherford. So move them because if we don't, they're going to be killed by the angry mob. 2 nights later, in the secrecy of dark, they were moved. And the town watched them be moved in this secret movement. So everybody's aware of what's going on. They're put into a convoy of 2 wagons and a buggy. And there are 6 prisoners and 7 guards, including Marion A. Wallace, the nephew of the dead Sheriff Wallace, who they call Little Marion. Perhaps not the best person to have as one of the deputies assigned to them. or maybe one of the best, depending on what you're trying to achieve. The guards were heavily armed. One of them carried extra weapons and ammunition. The 6 prisoners are George and Ep Marlow, shackled together by the ankle. Alf and Charlie Marlow, shackled together by the ankle. And Lewis Clift and William Burkhart, shackled together by the ankle. So if you get on your map and you look at Graham, the southeast edge of Graham, there's a creek, and that's the end of Graham. Today still, that's the actual border. That's the creek in question. That's Dry Creek. At the time, it would have been several miles outside of Graham, but that's the one they're going to cross on the southeast side of Graham, where Graham ends. If you've ever been to Graham, Graham is a rather hilly place. It kind of feels like the beginning of the hill country. You kind of descend down into Graham, and it's because it's so close to the Brazos River. As the convoy left, several residents watched this, and one of them watching it was the county attorney, Fleet Martin, who the Marlows said, "I know him. He was in the mob that tried to kill us 2 days ago." So there's the county attorney, who apparently was one of those people. As they were making their way outside of Graham, suddenly the convoy stopped. Somebody yelled, "Hold!" Other people yelled, "Hold!" And now they're stuck on this road in the dark. It was about 8:30 at night when they were doing this, about 9 o'clock when all this would have finally gone down. So here's the story that we get again, this newspaper, as you get again the Dallas Morning News. Bloody work of a mob. They attack prisoners under guard with fearful effect. 5 men are shot dead. 2 brothers shackled to their dead brothers, and then some other people. So outside of Graham last night, Deputy Marshal Ed Johnson started to Weatherford with the 4 Marlow brothers and 2 other prisoners named Burkhart and Cliff. And the following guards: Sam Creswell, Sam Wagner, John D. Gerard, T.A. Martin, Marion Wallace Jr., and William Hollis. The party left Graham at 8:30 with 2 hacks and 1 buggy. While ascending the hill after crossing Dry Creek, 2 miles from town, they were attacked from each side of the road by a body of masked men. Johnson was jerked from the back by the mob, and the firing commenced. So again, here, this is the marshal is pulled off by the mob to save his life, to get him out of the way. That's debatable, but they weren't there to kill him. Johnson was wounded in the fleshy part of the hand. Remember, he only has 1 arm, so he's now fully incapacitated. He can't do anything now because he's been shot in his only hand that he had left. Sam Creswell and Alf and Ep Marlow were killed. Again, Alf is chained to Charlie, and Ep is chained to George. By the attacking party, Bruce Wheeler and Frank Harmison were killed, and Eugene Logan dangerously wounded. Those are the attackers. Logan is constable of the Belknap precinct. So yet another law enforcement is one hiding in the darkness. Wheeler and Harmison were stockmen. The Marlows were shackled together in pairs, and 1 of each was killed. The other 2 freed themselves. If you've seen Sons of Katie Elder, John Wayne pulls out his rifle to free himself from poor dead Earl Holliman. That's not what happened in the real story. They freed themselves by cutting off the feet of their dead brothers at the ankle joint with a knife that they took. That's how they got free. They found a knife by one of the dead deputies, and they hacked off the foot of their dead brother who had been chained to them. Ed Johnson lost his right arm back in Wichita Falls a year ago, and with this wound, he remained completely powerless. Because there were guns in wagons, the 2 remaining Marlows, Charlie and George, were able to get some of those guns and defend themselves. And yet again, the mob was repulsed. They didn't succeed in the jail. They don't succeed here. And just like in Sons of Katie Elder, for the Marlows, they have to figure out, what do we do now? A mob wants to kill us. We're accused of these crimes. Our brothers are dead. And what they do is they go back to their home, and they barricade themselves in and say, we're not coming out until you get some other law enforcement people here. And there are some people in the area, including a Texas Ranger, including a doctor, who are aware of the commotion, are not happy that an angry mob is trying to just jump them. And again, that's not justice. And they're going to try to intercede on their behalf and say, let's wait and find out. Let's do something different here. So here's some of the reports of that come in later on. Again, from the Dallas Morning News. This story is from 1946. This is the son of Deputy Marshal Johnson. When it was over, 5 men were dead, 2 Marlows, 1 guard, 2 mobsters. 5 were wounded, 2 Marlows, Deputy Johnson, 2 mobsters. 15 pools of blood were counted the next day by the deputy's teenage son, now 70. Nearly 100 trees had bullet holes, and where 1 mobster had worked a buckshot load 10-gauge shotgun were 25 empty shells. So again, they came completely prepared for this. Again from the Dallas Morning News, there's a report that says, after the fight was through, George said, "How will we get loose from the boys?" And I said, this is from Charlie. Charlie's reporting this many years later. "If you get a knife, we will have to unjoint their ankles." He took brother by the boot leg and dragged him on the ground 5 or 6 feet and got his knife out of his pocket and turned his back to me and wetted the knife on a rock and freed me and stood there until I got loose. He said, "Our poor brothers are dead and their souls are in heaven." So a disturbing way for them to have to go about this. And again, if they really are innocent, I can't imagine anything more horrible than how this continues to present itself for them. Well, the news gets back to Dallas of what's going on. Captain Morton and Ben Cable left this morning for Graham to attend to the Marlow matter. Ben Cable is the son of the marshal, and he will go on to be the mayor of Dallas in 1900 to 1904, and his son will go on to be the mayor of Dallas from 1961 to 1964. So the grandson of this Marshal Cable or Cabell was the mayor during the Kennedy assassination in Dallas. So the son, Ben, and W.H. Morton were sent to arrest George and Charlie and to bring them to justice, to deliver them from the mob. We got 2 jobs here. We're going to put you under arrest and also protect you from this angry mob. After the ambush, Mrs. Marlow buried her sons, Ep and Alf, in a cemetery just across the line in Jack County. So if you follow the map, there's a road called, coming out southeast, basically the same road they were on, called Finnis, F-I-N-I-S, and it wanders around and it'll go to the Finnis or Finney Cemetery in Jack County, just to the east of Young County. And that's where they're buried. So you can see all of that on your map as well. So that's January 22nd, 1889. Here's a story from January 30th, 1889. Boone Marlow's death. He was called on to throw up his hands, but instead he whipped out his revolver, claiming the reward. This is from this is to the Gazette from Henrietta, Texas. So, Old Fort Sill Road goes from Fort Sill to Henrietta. It's the military road that goes all the way to Jack County to Fort Richardson. Before that, it actually was the Comanche Road that connected the springs that the Comanche used, and that's where the Army built it along they could follow the paths where the Comanche had been dragging their travel on, since they didn't have wheels on carts. And so that's how they knew how to build their road. And so it goes to Henrietta, and then from there, the road that goes south out of Henrietta, 148 South, is called Graham Street, because it's the road to the federal courthouse in Graham to the southwest. And that's the path that's going to be taken in this particular account. Little more has been learned of the killing of Boone Marlow, other than that sent to the Gazette yesterday. It occurred on Hell Roaring Creek, several miles to the east of Fort Sill, Indian Territory. It seems that Marlow had an appointment to meet one Harbolt at that place, and Matt Beavers and John Derrickson, finding it out, concealed themselves at the appointed place to capture him. Their story is that when Marlow approached, when they were hidden in the bushes, they called to him to throw up his hands. But instead, he only looked about him to see where the voices came and reached for his pistol, the only weapon he had. They called to him to the second or third time to throw up his hands, when he raised his pistol and fired, the ball striking a tree behind which Beavers stood. Beavers then opened fire on him with a shotgun loaded with buckshot, several balls striking him in the head and face, killing him instantly. At the same time, Derrickson opened fire on him with a Winchester and claims to have shot him through the body. Though Sheriff Wright, this would be Sheriff Cooper Wright, he's the sheriff of Clay County, who examined the body when it was brought through here in Henrietta, found no wounds except those made by the buckshot. The killing occurred on Thursday evening, and Beavers and Derrickson started with the body to Graham, passing through here last Sunday afternoon. So a week after the killing of their brothers in Graham, Boone Marlow was killed by these men of his acquaintance, and one of them I read about suggested that actually one of them was the brother of his girlfriend. The bounty hunters were out for the bounty of $1,500 today. That'd be about $40,000. They claimed that Boone had resisted them, which I would point out that if there were people hiding in dark bushes and yelling at me to put my hands up, I might resist too. So that was the story on January the 30th. Here's the story from February the 17th. United States Marshal Cabell yesterday received a telegram from Henrietta advising him of the arrest by Captain Morton of Derrickson, Beavers, and Harbolt. The 3 men who have killed Boone and brought him to Justice Collector Ward have now been arrested themselves. under an indictment found by the United States grand jury charging them with killing Boone Marlow in the Indian Territory. Marlow, it will be remembered, was killed to secure the $1,500 reward which had been offered for his apprehension. Among the questions involved is the right of a person from any state to kill a man in the Indian Territory without warrant from the federal government. So what crime have they committed? They went and shot a guy in the Indian Territory without any permission to do it. They were not licensed to do that. Now, an autopsy that was performed of Boone Marlow found that he had actually not died from his wounds. He had been poisoned earlier. So they shot him to cover up the fact they'd already poisoned him. So clearly they had been having drinks with the guy and killed him there and then shot him. And the reason why the other guy claimed to shot him with the rifle was to add to the fact that we were so scared we had to shoot him. But they've in fact murdered him with poison. Boone was then buried in the same plot with his brothers, Ep and Alf, in the same cemetery in Jack County, which is why you see here Alfred and Boone, and then Ellie again, that'd be Llewellyn or Ep, the same person. Marlow was mobbed, and then it gives their years, and it has 20 and 22, and exactly what it's saying there about the other brothers, a little unclear, but again, they're all in their early 20s. The Marlows, in March the 25th, 1889, the Dallas Morning News says, the Marlows acquitted. Graham, Texas, March 25th, Charlie and George Marlow were arraigned in the United States District Court today, charged with larceny of horses in the Indian Territory in March 1888. The district attorney saw he had no evidence to offer that would convict them, and the jury was instructed to return a verdict of not guilty. They were immediately bound over in the sum of $250 each for their appearance as witnesses at the October term of the United States Circuit Court of Graham. That means that the original accusation, they're now found not guilty. All of this has happened, and they're not guilty of the initial crime. Then in December 1890, events in Fort Worth importing prisoners from Dallas. The Dallas jail was filled up, and so they were moving them to Fort Worth. This morning, 11 United States prisoners were brought to this city from Dallas and lodged in the county jail. The cause of the prisoners being brought here is the crowded condition of the county jail in Dallas. Among these here are the young county prisoners indicted for implication in the attempt to lynch the Marlow brothers. They're free and found not guilty. Their attackers are now in jail. On April 1891, the Marlow mob trial. Again from the Morning News. The jury in the Marlow mob case rendered the following verdict. Eugene Logan, Sam Wagner, and Marion Wallace Jr., little Marion, the nephew of the dead sheriff, guilty of conspiracy. And the following found not guilty: Dick Cook, Josh Lavelle, Vernon Wilkinson, and William Hollis. So again, here the mob has been found guilty, not the Marlow brothers. Little Marion Wallace, having been found guilty, not of murder, but of conspiracy, they appealed their decision. And in 1892, the United States Supreme Court set it aside. So that's how the story ends, at the U.S. Supreme Court, with them ruling that the mob is also not guilty. None of the Dry Creek Seven ever served prison time for their crimes. They were never tried again. The Supreme Court ordered that there be a new trial. That trial never occurred. And so ultimately what we learned about this is nothing was resolved. Nobody went to jail, nobody spent any time, but people died anyway. That's the West. That's the confusing, messy West. And there's one little aspect also of the West that we can kind of know about. From 1891, this again, the Morning News, it says, the bloody stone on which the Marlow brothers amputated their dead brother's legs. In the United States Marshal's Office in Dallas is a curiosity with quite a tragic record, it being no less than the stone on which Alf and Ep Marlow amputated the legs of their dead brothers during the attack of the mob in Young County. Now that's backwards. They were the ones who had their legs amputated, but that's what this stone is. It will be remembered that the four Marlows were chained by the legs in pairs, and in the death struggle after each of the pair was shot down, the living brothers prepared for deadly action by relieving themselves of the corpses in the manner stated. The stone is almost circular, about 14 inches in diameter, 4 inches thick, and its upper side is blood-stained. So the marshal has a souvenir from this experience, the very rock where they cut off their legs. George and Charlie had survived all of this. They were the defendants or plaintiffs in more legal cases. They successfully sued the mob, and accusing them of having ruined their lives, and got something from that. In 1891, the Texas Rangers captain Bill McDonald, for whom he's the one riot, one ranger guy, was involved in going to arrest them. They yet again moved to Colorado, again where Charlie's in-laws were from. And they're going to stay there several different times. There are attempts for them to come and be witnesses in these cases or do something about it, and they usually choose not to go back because they think, I don't know why, but they think maybe a mob might try to kill them. And so they'd say, we'd rather not go to Texas, let's just stay in Colorado because these people here kind of like us. And so again, they never really did return. So what ends up happening is that the governor of Texas and the governor of Colorado are writing to actually telegram each other, trying to figure out how we're going to do this thing. How we're going to get these guys back and what's going on. And my last newspaper accounts I want to read are the accounts from Colorado. This is from the Ridgeway Herald in Colorado, where they're living at this time. This is happening in May of 1891. The Texas Rangers were armed to the teeth with Winchesters and revolvers in anticipation of trouble in making the arrest of the Marlows in Colorado. The Marlows were likewise healed, and when they all met and shook hands, it was noticeable that the shaking was all done with the left hand. The boys treated the officers courteously, however, and everything passed off smoothly. So, don't nobody kill me. They refused arrest, and in this weird scenario, actually they had been deputized, which is probably what's happening here, and they had actually arrested each other. And so because they were federal deputies themselves, they could not be taken by the Texas Rangers because they were holding each other in arrest, which that's a legal maneuver I'm assuming wouldn't really work today, but that's what they did to try to delay what feared like to their friends a rush to justice. The newspaper continues on and said, you're going to need more men instead of these two Rangers. That's what the townspeople say. Here's what the people circulated a petition through the newspaper, setting forth that the Marlow boys are known by the signers to be good and law-abiding citizens of Ouray County, and praying the governor that they may be permitted to remain here. The Marlows deserve the support of all citizens in their endeavor to be freed from persecution. So whatever happened in Oklahoma and Texas, in Colorado, they actually served with law enforcement. They arrested bank robbers. They did things on that side. And it reminds me of the Earps. Sometimes they're the law and sometimes they're the criminal. It just depends on what town they're in. There's something about that here. That's what the West is. None of these guys is a white hat and none of them is that black hat. Maybe the mob. But on the other hand, if you think that they murdered your friend, maybe that would be justice for you at the time. But everybody here is on the edge of something. When Charlie died, Charlie died on the 52nd anniversary of the attack by the mob. When his brother George died, here's what the Montrose Daily Press said. The wildest Western fiction magazines have never produced men of greater courage or more daring and remarkable incidents that were enacted in real life by these famous brothers. Arriving in this country, the Marlows were always perfectly law-abiding citizens and earned hundreds of friends, not one of whom was ever let down. And that's why in the movie The Sons of Katie Elder, as sketchy as John Wayne is, and as Dean Martin is, and as not good to their mother as they are, and all the things that happen, at the end we're left thinking that they were the wronged party here. That yes, they had lived questionable lives and had done questionable things, but they were moving through life, literally through the West, trying to make a better life for themselves. And sometimes, for whatever reason, things turned against them. And yet, when they built a new life for themselves, for those people, they were friends. Now, does that make them heroes? I don't know about that. I'm going to leave that to other people. But it certainly makes them human. The ability to move on with life and raise a family and make friends, knowing that this went on. And when you study history, when you study American history, that's what you find. People who endure, people who adapt, people who suffer and struggle, but people who continue on and on and on. And thanks to this movie, thanks to these stories, thanks to exhibits like this, the Marlow Brothers will always live on. Thank you.